Nice to have you with us. In studio this evening, South Africa's most renowned wine authority, Michael Fridjhon. We said last week that we were going to be talking about an alternative investment in this week's show. We thought we'd take a look at wine as that alternative investment. Mike, nice to have you on the show.
Great pleasure to be here.
Can you make money out of investing in wine?
Well, the guys who track the indices say you can. And the answer is that they look over a period of time, as all investments do, and conveniently at this stage they're not looking at what's happened in the last 2 or 3 months, where the international markets in wine have certainly melted down fairly dramatically. I mean, some of the real blue chip wines like 2008 vintage Lafite has dropped nearly 50% over the 3-month period.
Now, is that just because investors are turning around and saying, I don't know if I've got the appetite for... Can you say I don't have an appetite for wine?
It's hard not to have an appetite for wine, but perhaps wine investment.
Where's this whole industry flourished? Is this coming out of Asia?
It's had a series of waves, and I think what is making investors anxious now is that the last of the waves, which is the Asian wave, seems to be running out of steam. And we'll talk in detail as to why this may have happened. But for the guys who give you the index, it's based on a select number of wines. There is a wine investment index called the Livex, which is traded in London, and it's focused primarily on top Bordeaux, and it's loaded in favor of the so-called first growths, of which there are 5.
What is a first growth now?
When the wines of the Medoc, which is one part of Bordeaux, were classified in 1855, and it wasn't the first classification, but it's the one that seems to have stuck. 4 wines then, and subsequently 1 more, were rated as the first tier. So that's what a first growth is. Okay. And it's Lafite Rothschild, Latour, Chateau Margaux, Chateau Haut-Brion, and in 1973, Chateau Mouton Rothschild. Once you're classified as a first growth, you are in a peg above anything below you.
So those are the top wines in the world?
Those are the top Bordeaux or Cabernet-based wines. And because Bordeaux is a relatively large area, it means that even the top estates in the Medoc have a reasonable supply of wine to come to market. So typically we're looking at producers who've got 12 to 20,000 cases of their best wine each year to sell, which makes it completely different from a market like Burgundy, where the top wines are available in quantities of 1,000, maybe 1,500 cases, and so real shortage, in other words, over demand, driving price to insane levels, is a feature. But because traditionally this has been the Bordeaux market, and because the Bordeaux trade has traditionally run a very neat little cash flow business, which is that they sell the wine as futures, it has become an investment tool, particularly in the last 3 decades.
Okay, wait, hang on. Let's go back on this now. So you've got these 5 Bordeaux wines, which are, they will produce their wine, and they are listed on the Livex.
The price of the wine is listed on the Livex, yes.
For each of the individual
chateaus,
wines.
exactly, and in fact for each vintage. So when they create the index, they're looking at a mixture, a bit like a stock exchange index, the FTSE or whatever, but it's loaded in favor of Medoc wines, and primarily the high-priced Medoc wines. There are other wines that make up the Livex 100. Obviously, there are 100 wines, but the loading and the primary indicator is the Bordeaux first growths in terms of the health of the market and the investment appetite of the buyers.
Okay. Then what else is included in that Livex 100? Is it
French?
Is it French?
It's French.
All of it?
That's a good question. Probably. I have to say I can't think of a single wine that's made it to the Livex 100 that isn't, but if it is, it's 1 or 2. It is a French-dominated, Bordeaux-dominated list, and it represents wines which have got a traditional history in terms of price and in terms of quality. The Livex itself is 10 or 15 years old as an index, and its existence already, if you like, is an indicator that people were looking at wine as a speculative tool. And in that 10 or 15 year period of recent history, wine investment funds and other instruments which enable people to create, if you like, unit trusts
Okay.
in wines that are internationally recognized, and therefore for the unit trust manager, wines that can be sold and bought with relative ease. That has become the basis on which wine investment as a serious tool has evolved.
Okay. I know nothing about wine. Well, I know very, very little about wine. There are a handful of wines that I know I like. I've tasted them and they appeal to my palate. So when I go out and for dinner, if I'm going to have a glass of wine, I know what I'm going to ask for. I don't have the inclination to go and read columns that you write and things like Platter's Wine Guide and all the rest of it. But if I want to invest in wine, is that Livex the way to go?
Well, perhaps what I need to do is to suggest that there aren't readily available alternatives. In other words, if you decided you wanted to invest in South African wine, and you decided you could identify the equivalent of the first growth estates, with or without my help, without the Platter Guide, whatever, and you found 5 or 6 wines which by a general consensus are South Africa's top properties. Your problem is, firstly, that you need, for an investment to operate, a relatively easy way of buying into the market and an equally easy way of exiting from the market.
Yeah.
And your problem as an end user in South Africa starts with 14% VAT.
Okay.
So you are not VAT registered unless you have a license. So you have to pay VAT as an end user, and the person who buys from you is in the same position. Secondly, there isn't a readily available auction market in this country. There were attempts in the 80s and 90s, I was at a time the wine consultant to Sotheby's in South Africa, to create not just an auction market such as the Nederburg auction or the Cape Winemakers Guild, but a place where private consumers could rotate the stocks in their cellars. It never really took off because the amount of labor involved in managing a wine auction is the same or more than goes into an art auction, except that an Irma Stern sells for 5 to 15 million rand a picture, whereas you've got to sell a hell of a lot of wine to get through that kind of number. So there are no auction houses selling wine.
But now hang on, okay, and this is another way of investing in wine as far as I know, because I have an acquaintance who used to work for the for Foreign Affairs, and he was posted to Hong Kong, and he left Foreign Affairs and he bought a whole series of storage units which were perfect for wine storage.
Absolutely, Mr. Deeb.
That's
Greg
it.
Deeb.
You know him.
He runs Castle Cellars in...
So you know Greg.
I know Greg, and I've been through his setup in Hong Kong, and it is wonderful. But he is, if you like, a repository of wine. He is a place where the wealthy of Hong Kong can store their wine and, in fact, go to the restaurant on the premises, the extraordinary premises. It's an old ammunition kind of dump in the middle of a hill. So the temperature is perfect, the wine stocks are extraordinary, and for people who are living on the island, who have infinite resources of wealth and don't want to store their entire cellar somewhere 50 k's away in the New Territories, what Greg has set up is very clever. You don't even have that here. The other day somebody said to me, like to store 20 or 40 cases in perfect air-conditioned circumstances in the Gauteng area, and I couldn't think of a place. I can think of one in the Cape. So for the person who wants to invest in South African wine, you've got VAT as a problem. You don't have an easily accessed secondary market, an auction environment, a place where you can trade out without paying 20 or 30% commission to the broker in between. And you don't have a place where you can store sufficient quantities of wine in safe enough conditions that you can make that investment anything more than a flutter.
But surely there is a gap in the market then for somebody to build a storage facility, which also, as you said, you can attach a restaurant to, so you can drink the wine that you stored in the restaurant, and use that as an auction facility. So the people who are storing their wine can turn around and say, you know what, I've got 40 cases of XYZ. I want to get rid of 20. On the next auction, will you put them on the auction sheet?
You may well be right. The closest attempt to that in the past was the Bergkelders Vinatech scheme, And that founded on a number of problems. Firstly, the wines themselves did not retain investment value. They were sold and the people bought them in good faith, and if you bought them through the Vinatec, you were allowed to store the wine in the Vinatec's storage. When people came 5, 10 or 15 years later, having had these annual reports from the Vinatec telling everybody how wonderfully the wines were progressing, and I know a case of somebody who was in fact, I think, their biggest investor, and he said, you know what, I'd like to sell a lot of my holdings. Oh, well, you know, the wines haven't really matured that well and we can't guarantee. And he looked at it, he'd have done better putting his money in the post office, if not exactly in the mattress. So historically, we don't have a readily credible track record that says it happens. So the person who comes along and does a Greg Deeb in South Africa will have to persuade gun-shy South Africans that this is another possible investment. In other words, that what happened in the past was an aberration and the future will be different. And he then needs to persuade them that older wine is worth something, because the biggest problem in the South African market is because of the progress made by South African wineries who've been making better and better wine every year. People want the young wine. They're saying, you know what, I like the latest vintage, I'm not sure I like the taste of the older wines. So there isn't a demand for the older wines, which is what drives the international investment market. And that has, from an investment perspective, a huge problem in South Africa and a huge benefit internationally. And that is that as people drink wine, in other words, as the vintages get older and get better, the stock available gets less, so it becomes rarer, and that's what drives the price of the wines from the 1980s. Whereas in South Africa, you've got 10 cases of 1982 wine, try and sell them. A lot of people look at them and say, not sure that that wine has survived 30 years. I believe the best wines do, but the punters out there are not convinced.
Michael Fridjhon is our guest in the studio this evening. We are talking about alternative investments, and this evening we're looking at investing in wine. There are all sorts of other ways of investing in wine, and we'll start looking at those in just a moment. Don't you go away.